Good evening and greetings, participants, to this lecture. I'd like to welcome everybody tonight. This event is the fourth in a series of 6 lectures. The lecture series is titled Why Study the History of Trotskyism, and these have been organised by the Socialist Equality Party, which is the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. My name is Patrick O'Connor. I'm a member of the SEP's National Committee, and I'll be chairing the event tonight. In this series, we began, as I raised before, for those of you who logged on early, with the opening lecture was on the question of the October 1917 revolution, the opening shot of the world revolution. We then discussed the question of the left opposition struggle against Stalinism, and last week delved into the complex political issues bound up with the founding of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution in 1938. Tonight we are going to be as you can see on the slide there, discussing the International Committee of the Fourth International and the war against Pabloism, which is an event of immense and contemporary political significance within this situation. Thank you for those participants who've already let us know where you've logged on from, both across Australia and internationally. Very special comradely welcome to those international participants tonight. We very much appreciate your involvement. Some of you may be staying up late, getting up early, but it's very important to have this broad international participation in this event. But I'd like to now introduce our meeting participants. Zac Hambides will be our main speaker tonight. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Zac. He joined the party in 2007 and ever since has played an important role within the SEP's youth wing, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the IYSSE. Now 32, he's a member of the SEP's National Committee. He works in the university sector and he's been actively involved recently in the party's campaign against the tertiary union's attempt to impose really severe wage cuts on university workers on behalf of the federal government and university administrators. He's also a contributor to the World Socialist website. He's written on Australian politics, social issues confronting young people, the opportunism of the pseudo-left organisations, among other topics. So after Zac's lecture, we'll also have on our panel Nick Beams, as with previous weeks. Nick, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a foremost authority on Marxist political economy and history. He's a regular writer for the World Socialist website. He's the former National Secretary of the SEP here and an ongoing member of the World Socialist website International Editorial Board. Nick delivered the first lecture in this series on the Russian Revolution. And as I raised before, anybody who hasn't seen that lecture or others in this series can click on the link that you'll see in the chat box to our YouTube and Facebook accounts of the SEP, where you can review the video footage of those events. We do have, just before I hand things over to Zac, just to let everybody know, we have, as I'm sure you can see in the chat box there, we have participants from across Australia, different states, South Australia, Victoria, Queensland, as well as greetings from New Zealand. Again, welcome comrades. And we have international participants from Detroit in the United States, Michigan, likewise the United States, Barcelona in Spain, other centres as well, I believe. Greetings from International Committee of the Fourth International Supporters in India. Thank you very much, comrades. Greetings from South Africa. Greetings from, I believe there was Tamil Nadu in India. So a very warm welcome to all participants. But now I'd like to introduce Comrade Zac. Good evening, Zac.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for that very warm welcome. And I would also like to welcome everyone to this meeting, which, as Patrick has indicated, is the fourth in our series on the history of the Trotskyist movement. In this week's lecture, it is about the monumental struggle to defend the Fourth International in the post-war period. During this time, the Fourth International was subject to a series of revisionist attacks from within its own ranks, which threatened to liquidate the entire Trotskyist movement. Had a determined international struggle not taken place, which reached its high point with the issuing of the open letter by James P. Cannon of the American Socialist Workers' Party, that is precisely what would have taken place. Those who are new to the socialist movement often ask us, what is the difference between the Socialist Equality Party and all other so-called socialist and left-wing groups? Well, a review of this history demonstrates the class chasm separating our movement from the petty bourgeois and pseudo-left groups. In the final analysis, the differences that arose within the Fourth International represented irreconcilably opposed class interests. Now, the roots of this revisionism can be traced to the opposition that emerged within the Trotskyist movement at the very founding of the Fourth International. In August 1939, the Burnham-Shatman tendency, which Max spoke about last week, argued that the Stalinist bureaucracy was a new oppressing class and that the USSR was state capitalist. The logic conclusion of this position was that the working class, if the working class takes power, it will not provide the basis for the construction of a genuinely socialist and egalitarian society. Instead, all the socialist revolution could hope to achieve would be a new form of class oppression. In changing the definition of the USSR, Burnham and Shatman were making a complete break with the entire foundations and principles of the Marxist movement. Now, in the final analysis, Shatman and Burnham's positions reflected shifts among layers of the middle class who were deeply demoralized by the defeats of the working class in the 1930s. Shatman had played a leading and important role in the Trotskyist movement. However, what both of them were giving expression to were alien and hostile political tendencies, which found their way into the Fourth International. You can trace the political origins of the various state capitalist tendencies operating today to the Burnham-Shatman tendency. Socialist alternative in Australia is one example. Now, during World War II, a tendency emerged within the German section of the Fourth International called the Three Thesis Group. They were also known as the retrogressionists. Now, they argued that due to the victory of the fascists across Europe, including in Germany, civilization had been turned back 100 years to conditions that predated 1848. That is, prior to the publication of the Communist Manifesto. Now, these positions also found support within the US section, in the faction led by Albert Goldman and Felix Morrow, who were quickly defeated within the Socialist Workers' Party. But the persistence of revisionism pointed to the powerful class pressures on the newly formed Fourth International. To the impressionistic observer, the situation did appear hopeless during the war. Fascism had consolidated power throughout Europe, forcing entire sections of the Fourth International underground. Then there was the war itself, which witnessed the greatest slaughter of human beings in history. An estimated 85 million people died, 55 million of them civilians. The greatest slaughter was carried out by the Third Reich against the population of the Soviet Union. 27 million were killed, including 13 million Soviet citizens. 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated in the Holocaust. The war ended with the dropping of atomic bombs by the US military on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Capitalism emerged out of World War II, dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt, to borrow a phrase from Marx. While demoralized layers of the middle-class intelligentsia were concluding that the situation for mankind was hopeless and shifted to the right, the working class, however, was shifting to the left. The revisionists claimed that Trotsky's prognosis of revolutions after World War II had not been realized. In fact, the end of the war saw the eruption of mass movements, general strikes, and revolutionary upheavals internationally, as well as powerful anti-colonial movements in almost all the colonies. Workers were disgusted with capitalism and the two world wars, Great Depression, and fascist barbarism it had produced. The chief reason why capitalism survived was not due to any inherent strength, but the role of Stalinism. The Stalinist bureaucracy was determined to prevent the extension of socialist revolutions internationally, because if the working class did take power in another country, it would directly threaten its privileged position within the USSR. The communist parties worked to rescue capitalism, capitalist governments in every country after country, in some cases where workers were on the verge of insurrection. This came as a shock to many workers who had seen the Red Army defeat the Nazis at a terrible cost of human life. This had given the Communist parties enormous authority in the working class. For example, in Italy, workers caught Mussolini trying to escape the country, shot him, and hung him upside down in Milan to prove to all that the hated dictator was now dead, only to then be told by the Stalinists that socialism was off the agenda and to join with monarchist forces to create a bourgeois government. Global capitalism was in a major crisis, but British imperialism, the former world power, was expended. It could not deal with the situation. The United States became the gendarme of world imperialism. This was a significant shift in US foreign policy. It may come as a surprise to some watching, but the US military was relatively small in the period between the world wars, and its activity was focused mainly in Latin and Central America, with the exception of the Russian Civil War after the October Revolution. The aim of the US was to stave off revolution by integrating the European countries back into the imperialist fold through the Marshall Plan in 1948. The real target, however, was the Soviet Union, and saw US President Truman in 1947 launch the Cold War. Immediately after the war, the Stalinists did not expropriate the capitalists in Eastern Europe. It was in response to the new US policy to contain the USSR that the Stalinist bureaucracy decided to nationalize the property in a series of buffer states in Eastern Europe, creating new worker states. These states were a new political phenomenon. While they were worker states, they had been established bureaucratically from above. That is, not as the result of the taking of power by the working class. They were deformed from birth, which is how the Trotskyist movement defined them after a protracted discussion, as deformed worker states. Contained in this definition is the political perspective that the regimes could not last in their current form, and that the working class must overthrow the bureaucracies in a political revolution, or else risk the restoration of capitalism. In the late 1940s, an impressionistic observer would conclude that the world was dominated politically by imperialism on the one hand and Stalinism on the other. This gave rise to a political mood of pessimism among layers of the middle class, which again found reflection in the Fourth International. Michel Pablo, the secretary of the Fourth International, and his collaborator, Ernest Mandel, used the formulation deformed worker state as the starting point for a new revisionist assault on the principles of the Trotskyist movement. Like Burnham and Shatman, Pablo rejected the revolutionary role of the working class. The difference is that while Burnham and Shatman defined the Stalinist bureaucracy as a new exploitative class, ruling class, the Pabloites declared that Stalinism was the irreversible road to socialism. While the counter-revolutionary positions of Burnham and Shatman were clear from the outset, Pablo sought to smuggle his revisions into the Fourth International. In 1951, Pablo wrote, "Objective social reality consists essentially of the capitalist regime and the Stalinist world." That is, social reality did not include the class struggle. The working class was not a factor in Pablo's scheme, and as a result, the Fourth International had no independent role to play. Pablo argued that a nuclear war between the USSR and the imperialist powers would inevitably erupt and would take the form of a revolutionary war. But instead of spelling the destruction of mankind in a nuclear winter, this would provide the basis for the construction of socialism. Under pressure from the masses from below and imperialism from above, the Stalinist bureaucracy would be compelled to construct more deformed workers' states around the world. This would take place not in the immediate period, but over a period of centuries. In 1952, Pablo outlined a new form of entryism. Sections of the Fourth International were to enter Stalinist, social democratic, or petty bourgeois nationalist formations for an extended period. The aim would not be to win the best layers of workers to the Trotskyist movement, but to push these mass parties to the left. The essence of Pabloite revisionism was the complete political and physical liquidation of the Trotskyist movement. From a revolutionary party established in a deadly and principled fight against all forms of nationalism, which includes Stalinism, the Fourth International was to adapt itself to the bureaucracy and become an advisor to whatever tendency dominated the mass movement at the time, whether led by Stalinist, social democrats, or petty bourgeois nationalists. The quote-unquote least likely variant, according to Pablo, is that the working class would come to power under the leadership of a Bolshevik-type party, like in Russia in 1917. The French section was ordered to enter the Communist Party and subordinate all practical and political considerations to this tactic. Pablo slandered the Chinese Trotskyists, who had been jailed by the Chinese Communist Party for conducting a courageous and principled fight against Maoism. Pablo denounced the Trotskyists as sectarians and fugitives from revolution, and declared the CCP's seizure of power in 1949 demonstrated that a non-Bolshevik party could lead a revolution. In 1953, two further events conclusively demonstrated Pabloism's counter-revolutionary role. A strike by building workers on June the 16th in East Germany quickly developed into demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of workers. This was the first mass proletarian uprising against Stalinism since its usurpation of power in the Soviet Union. The Kremlin responded with tanks, at least 100 were killed, and 6 strike leaders were executed. While Soviet troops were shooting down workers, Pablo declared that the Stalinist regime would be compelled to, quote-unquote, dole out concessions under pressure from the strikes. The fact that the bureaucracy had instead responded with bullets gave Pablo no cause for reflection. The same pro-Stalinist line was to be repeated in August 1953, when a general strike erupted in France. This was the biggest general strike in French history up till that point. Yet Pablo dismissed it as a mere prelude to a vast class struggle, while covering for the Stalinist-led unions. As the real counter-revolutionary and liquidationist role of Pabloism became clear, James P. Cannon acted decisively in defense of the principles of the Trotskyist movement. Cannon's A Letter to Trotskyists Throughout the World, or the Open Letter, is the founding document of the International Committee, which is the current leadership of the Fourth International. The Socialist Equality Party is the Australian section of this world movement. This document continues to both inspire revolutionaries and infuriate opportunists to this day. In the opening, Cannon states, Pablo is now working consciously and deliberately to disrupt, split, and break up the historically created cadres of Trotskyism in the various countries and to liquidate the Fourth International. Cannon succinctly and clearly articulated the fundamental principles of the Trotskyist movement in just a few points. Capitalism threatens civilization with destruction. This can only be avoided with the planned economy of socialism on a world scale. The accomplishment of this goal is only possible by the working class, led by a revolutionary party in the pattern developed by Lenin. The main obstacle to this is Stalinism, which is not the way of the future, but in the final analysis, a petty bourgeois agency of imperialism. The Open Letter was written under extremely difficult conditions. In the United States in 1953, anti-communism was a virtual state religion. The McCarthyite witch hunts were well underway, and the Hollywood blacklist had reached its height. The Rosenbergs were framed up for passing secret information on the US atomic bomb to the Soviet Union and executed in June. Cannon identified that a privileged layer of the generation that had carried out the mass strikes of the 1930s had been softened by the conditions of post-war prosperity. The post-war boom was underway, and it seemed like the American dream was finally being realized. Rather than adapt to these difficulties, Cannon powerfully articulated the revolutionary confidence of the Trotskyist movement. And I quote, "But the factor that sustains cadres under the most difficult circumstances is the burning conviction of the theoretical correctness of our movement, the knowledge that they are the living means for advancing the historic mission of the working class, the understanding that to one degree or another, the fate of humanity depends on what they do, the firm belief that whatever the momentary circumstances may be, the main line of historic development demands the creation of Leninist combat parties that will resolve the crisis of humanity through a victorious socialist revolution." Cannon concluded the Open Letter by stating, "The lines of cleavage between Pablo's revisionism and orthodox Trotskyism are so deep that no compromise is possible, either politically or organizationally. The Trotskyists must now assert their will against Pablo's usurpation of authority." Now, summing up the significance of the split with Pablo, Cannon wrote an open letter to George Brightman, in which he states, Germain, which was Mandel's party name, thinks he is orthodox on this question, but in practice he compromises the theory. We alone are unconditional adherents of the Lenin-Trotsky theory of the party, of the conscious vanguard, and its role as leader of the revolutionary struggle. Cannon explained that to admit that the socialist transformation of society can be carried out automatically is to abandon Marxism altogether. The Marxist Party is the conscious element in the historical process. It is required and no other party will do. Several sections rallied to Cannon's call. Most important among them was the French section and the British section under Jerry Healey. At that time, the Australian section was liquidated. Nick Orreglass, who had fought courageously during World War II and withstood physical attacks from both Stalinists and right-wing pro-war layers, could not withstand the pressure exerted by Pablo and disappeared into the Labour Party. Had it been purely a question of ideas and not social tendencies, the open letter would have laid the matter to rest there and then. But instead, this proved to be the start of a civil war within the Fourth International that only concluded in 1986 with the defeat of the national-opportunists of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. Pabloism reflected the deepest needs of imperialism as it emerged from World War II, which, as we reviewed, was in a historic crisis. It was necessary to cultivate a layer of the middle class that could act as a buffer between imperialism and the working class. Pabloism came to serve that role. Jerry Healey's response to the open letter was of crucial significance. He defended the struggle for Trotskyism in Britain in the face of provocative and violent efforts of Pablo and his accomplice, John Lawrence in Britain, to destroy the movement. In 1954, he wrote to a Sri Lankan Trotskyist, "The members of our section know all about Pabloism and its logical end, Stalinism, and we will have no truck with Pablo committee traps. We have only one answer to make to Pabloism in Britain, and that is to smash them politically and organizationally, and no one is going to talk us out of this." The crisis of the Stalinist regimes that erupted in 1956, when Khrushchev made a partial acknowledgement of Stalin's crimes, underscored the unbridgeable gulf between Trotskyist politics, defended by the International Committee of the Fourth International, and the revisionism of the Pabloites. Whereas the Pabloites restricted their response to speculation about the Stalinist bureaucracy's supposed ability to reform itself and play a progressive role in the USSR and internationally, the ICFI sought to clarify the critical issues of historical truth and political perspective and win the best layers of workers and intellectuals around the Stalinist parties to the Trotskyist movement. Jerry Healey, David North wrote in his biography, responded to Khrushchev's secret speech revelations with his characteristic energy. Traveling from one part of the country to the other, Healey was able to win important layers of the Communist Party to the Trotskyist movement. This was precisely because of the principled opposition of the British section to Pabloism and its agreement with the open letter. However, there were enormous pressures bearing down on the Trotskyist movement. Within 3 years of writing the open letter, Cannon proposed unity with the Pabloites based on quote-unquote concrete agreement on current tasks, but without a discussion on the 1953 split. Healey was central in preventing this unprincipled reunification from proceeding. It was not that reunification was put off the agenda by the IC, But if that were to proceed, then it would require a review of the critical issues of perspective contained in the 1953 split. A key development in this period was the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 by a band of petty bourgeois guerrilla fighters led by Fidel Castro. Cannon and the Socialist Workers' Party declared that under the pressure of events, Castro had been transformed into an unconscious Marxist. This was a new strain of the Pabloite revisionist disease, but this time being articulated by Cannon and the Socialist Workers' Party. Again, the role of Healey and the Socialist Labour League were decisive in opposing this new version of revisionism. However, we are dealing with social forces. As David North wrote in The Heritage We Defend, the Socialist Workers' Party was in the process of shifting its class orientation to a layer of the radical and not so radical middle-class intelligentsia. Some of the big, important people the SWP were orienting to included Jean-Paul Sartre, who supported Maoism and was an avowed opponent of Marxism. The fruits of this unprincipled reunification came 1 year later. Confronted with a potentially revolutionary situation in Sri Lanka, the Bandaranaike government had to make a choice. Who would they turn to in order to suppress this movement? They could either bring the military into the government or the workers' leaders. The LSSP, which was the Sri Lankan section of the Fourth International, made the unprecedented decision to enter the capitalist government in Colombo. This was the first time that a nominally Trotskyist party had entered a capitalist government. The implications of this betrayal were immense. It strengthened the Maoist forces all throughout Asia and contributed to the betrayal of the Indonesian working class, which led to a military coup 1 year later and the Suharto dictatorship. Had the LSSP not betrayed, then Sri Lanka would have served as a beacon for permanent revolution throughout Asia. After the Great Betrayal, members of the SWP demanded a discussion within the party on the events in Sri Lanka. They were immediately expelled from the party. Those members went on to form the Workers' League in 1966, the forerunner of the Socialist Equality Party. Therefore, the current US section of the ICFI was founded on a thoroughly principled basis, not over a question of tactics, but on an international question. It was based on the assimilation of the lessons of these struggles, particularly from 1953 onwards, that the Socialist Labour League, the precursor to the Socialist Equality Party, was founded in 1972 in Australia. We have insisted that 2020 marks the beginning of a decade of socialist revolution. It is therefore important to study the lessons of the last period of revolutionary upheavals. The post-war boom was rapidly coming to an end. The period 1968 to 75 saw the eruption of revolutionary upheavals by the working class on a global scale. This began with the French general strike in May-June 1968, which was even larger than the strike of 1953. The right-wing fascist and authoritarian regimes were overthrown, including the overthrow of the Greek junta. While the Stalinists and Social Democrats played the central role in suppressing the working class from taking power, they were assisted enormously by the Pabloites. Nowhere has this been more tragically verified than in Latin America. In Chile, for example, the election of the Allende government in 1970 saw the eruption of a mass movement of the working class. Workers established cordones, which were independent workers' committees that coordinated production across multiple factories in a single area. The largest concentration of the cordones was in Santiago, the state capital. It was widely known that the military was calling for a coup. The situation rested on a knife edge. The decisive factor was that the working class had been disarmed, not militarily, but politically. 3 years earlier, the leader of the Chilean section of the Fourth International, Luis Vitale, had liquidated into the MIR, petty bourgeois guerrilla movement. Vitale stated, "The unquestionable fact is that the revolutions of the post-war period have put on the order of the day mobile and guerrilla warfare, whose epicenter is in the countryside." This left the working class defenseless and allowed the bourgeoisie to solve the crisis through the September 11 coup by General Pinochet, in what was the first in a series of coups backed by US imperialism in Latin America. These issues of perspective have direct consequences, as we have seen in Sri Lanka and in Chile. Since 1973, the experience in Chile has been used by all manner of opportunists to argue that the working class cannot take power because imperialism is too strong and will crush any revolution. That was not the problem in Chile. The working class was poised to seize power and were more than capable of dealing with both US imperialism and the Chilean government and bourgeoisie. They only lacked the necessary revolutionary leadership to guide them. In opposition to the virtually uninterrupted assault by the revisionists, the internationalists maintained an unbroken line for the continuity of Marxism, which has remained to this day. This was under conditions that could now seem almost impossible. Yet the persistence of Trotskyism, which is to say modern-day Marxism, can only be attributed to a social force as well. Whatever the claims of the revisionists, the program and perspective of the Trotskyist movement is the conscious reflection of the objectively revolutionary character of the international working class. The history of this is of immense contemporary relevance. Multiracial, multi-ethnic protests have erupted in every continent on the planet. While the spark was the police murder of George Floyd, the fuel has come from a massive groundswell of social opposition to capitalism. All the political heirs of the revisionists in the pseudo-left groups are attempting to prevent the working class from taking up a revolutionary struggle against capitalism. Having broken from Trotskyism in the 20th century, these forces now insist the fundamental division in society is race, sex, or ethnicity, but not class. In the protests, they are working actively to sow illusions in the Democratic Party, who are offering petty reforms of the police while collaborating with Trump. The capitalist barbarism of the 20th century has not been dispelled, but it is reappearing internationally. The Trump administration is only the most significant expression of the turn by the ruling elite of every country to the far right, including in Australia. These experiences and the lessons that are derived from them are essential for the construction of an independent revolutionary movement today.
Thank you very much, Zac, for that really wide-ranging and important lecture. I think the contemporary burning significance of this struggle against Pabloism that was fought out in 1953 and subsequently within the International Committee. The Fourth International was certainly born out there. Excuse me, we do have a couple of initial questions. There was a question from Rebecca, which is, was there a connection between the emphasis on guerrilla warfare in the countryside in Chile and the planned way the Khmer Rouge conducted their genocide? So that's a question that deals with a couple of complex historical episodes, both in Cambodia as well as Chile. Before I throw that to our panel, and Nick Beams will be joining us in a moment, I would like to encourage anybody else with any questions to please use that chat box. If you would like Zac or the panel to elaborate on any of the issues touched on, both within the Fourth International and within the historical situation after World War II, you can please indicate that. As I said at the outset, we very much encourage your participation. If you haven't already, just click on that chat box feature. Make sure you click that blue button once you've done that and send your message to all panelists and attendees. I would like to make some announcements in relationship to Mary Books, but before I do that, I would like to express very warm solidarity, comradely greetings to one of our participants signing on from Britain, and that is Comrade Barbara Slaughter. Comrade Barbara is a member of our sister party in Britain, the Socialist Equality Party there. She is a veteran Trotskyist, joined the Trotskyist movement in Britain in 1958 after being clarified on the questions of Stalinism and particularly the violent Stalinist suppression of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. And she's now entering her 8th decade within the revolutionary movement, which is an extraordinary record. A very principled fighter against all forms of opportunism, rallied to the banner of the International Committee during the 1985-86 split with the WRP, national opportunists in Britain. So very warm welcome to you, Comrade Barbara. Good to have you with us. If you'd like to hit that chat box, you can send us a message if you would like to do that. Mary Books is really encouraging everybody here tonight to purchase a copy, if you don't already own one, of David North's The Heritage We Defend. You can see it behind Zac over his left shoulder there, but also on our slide there. You'll see that we're offering this at a discounted price, 15% off. That is for participants in this meeting tonight. The Heritage We Defend is a really unique book. What it does is sum up the crucial political and historical lessons in the history of the Fourth International, going right back to its founding in 1938, going through the question of the origin of the struggle against Pabloism, as Zac has covered in 1953, and then taking us right forward to the defeat of, as I said before, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, national opportunists in Britain in 1985-86. Without this book, without the struggle for the ideas that are contained within this book, our political movement wouldn't exist today. The World Socialist website wouldn't exist. That is really how crucial it is. And we'd really encourage everybody here who's seeking to deepen their understanding of what it is to take up the struggle for socialism, of what Trotskyism means within this political situation today. You really do need to review this history. Contained within it is not just a history of the Fourth International, as important as that is, but also is contained within it a history of political developments internationally since the 1930s. It goes through a number of key, crucial strategic experiences that the international working class passed through, and outlines a principled Trotskyist response in relationship to that. You'll see on the slide there, this is the 30th anniversary edition. It comes with a very important preface, written recently by Comrade David North, also a glossary of key individuals and organisations to help you assimilate this book. So I'd encourage everybody who doesn't own that to click on your email right now. Don't wait till after the meeting. You see the email address down the bottom of the slide there. Send it to mehring@aussiemail.com.au. That's Mehring, M-E-H-R-I-N-G, @aussiemail.com.au. So it's just $29.70 there. David North, as I raised previously, he's the chairman of the World Socialist website, International Editorial Board and the chairman of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. So crucial work there. The other work by David North is the biography of Jerry Healey. Like The Heritage We Defend, this work was referenced by Comrade Zac in his lecture. It's Jerry Healey and its place in the history of the Fourth International. Again, discounted price, that's for tonight only. You get 15% off if you email us tonight expressing your interest. So it's just $14.45, which is very, very low price of this work, which again is a critical review of a very important historical figure within the history of the Fourth International. Jerry Healey was the leader of the British Trotskyist movement for a whole period from the 1930s through to 1985. He's defended the principles of genuine Trotskyism against the attacks of the Pabloites, both in 1953 and in 1961 to 63. Ultimately, he did succumb to the very enormous political pressures, class pressures that were bearing down upon the British Trotskyists, and he did, through his actions, commit very gross betrayals of Trotskyist principles. But the review of Comrade David North is one based entirely on an objective Marxist method, seeking to understand the role that he played. Before he betrayed, he did make a very decisive and long-lasting contribution to the struggle for the Fourth International. So again, contained within this biography of an individual is a broader set of political issues and historical issues, without an understanding of which workers and young people today can't really take forward a struggle for genuine international socialism. So I encourage you to express your interest via that email there. We understand with the coronavirus and related exacerbation of the capitalist crisis that if you're a student or not working, it may be difficult to pay for these books straight away. That's okay. If you email us tonight, we'll reserve the books at those discounted prices and we can work out a payment plan from there. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome our panel. Perhaps I could introduce Comrade Nick. Good evening.
Good evening.
Do we want to tackle that question in relationship to Chile and Cambodia first?
Well, just to take it up, I think, it indicates, first we must start from basic issues. The peasantry and the proletariat are both oppressed by big capital. But they are different social classes and they react in different ways. And that was, of course, very much the question at the center of the Russian Revolution as well. The peasant question was very important. The peasants can play and do play and can play an important role in the political struggle, but not an independent one. And the question is, the decisive question is to win the peasantry to the side of the working class. The peasantry either goes with the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, as Trotsky explained. Town dominates country. Now, the peasant reaction to oppression is very different. The reaction of the working class is collectivism, to organize because of its life situation. The working class works in large factories, large industrial organizations. Its drive is to organize collectively society in the interests of the whole. The peasantry, however, has a very different reaction. Its reaction is one of individualism, to divide up resources among themselves and to seek an individual response to a crisis. And we saw that, very much in Cambodia, the destructive forces that were unleashed there. We also saw it in regard to China in the so-called Great Cultural Revolution of 1966, led by Mao, an attack on science, an attack on progress, even, musicians were, Beethoven wasn't allowed to be played, and so on. And this can give rise to extreme right-wing and reactionary tendencies. The issue in Latin America was very decisive. There was probably no continent where Stalinism was more discredited than in Latin America. This was because the line of the Stalinist parties in Latin America was that the national bourgeoisie in Latin America represented a progressive tendency. So in Cuba, for example, you had the Stalinist party supported the dictator Batista because he represented the progressive national bourgeoisie that at some stage in the future would give rise to conditions creating socialism and so on. So this orientation, this the hailing of the Cuba as a workers' state, Castro as an unconscious Marxist, had, as Zac explained very well, decisive implications in Latin America. In Chile in particular, the development of an industrial working class, the crucial question was to wrest the leadership of that class from Stalinism under conditions where it was particularly weak. That struggle was abandoned. The Chilean section of the Fourth International was liquidated into the MIR, the Movement of the Revolutionary Left, a petty bourgeois movement based on guerrillism and so on. And that was the decisive question. If you look at the history of Chile, it bears astonishing resemblance actually to the events in Petrograd in the Russian Revolution. And the decisive factor, though, was the absence of a Bolshevik party. And that was, above all, down to the responsibility of Pabloism. That perspective, based upon the working class, had been abandoned by the Pabloites, and various substitutes were developed. First Stalinism, and then petty bourgeois nationalist forces.
I mean, I would just add to that actually, and what strikes one when you do examine concretely the experiences in Chile is the experiences of the Russian Revolution. You can't help but be struck by it. I mean, the cordones, and I apologize if our pronunciation is off, but I believe it means cords. In other words, cords that connected workers, organizations and committees. These were sort of embryonic, Soviets really, for historical parallel, that could have formed and were starting to form the basis of workers' power. And the role of Pabloism was at this critical juncture to deny the working class a revolutionary perspective under conditions that, again, very similar to the Russian Revolution after the February Revolution. The generals were preparing a coup. And the issue was, as in Russia, which class was going to decide the outcome. In Russia, that of course was played, as we all know, by the working class. But the critical factor, the conscious factor, as Cannon, again and again stressed in the period, in 1953 and immediately afterwards, was the question of the revolutionary leadership. And that was the real damage that was done by Pabloism, was that it attacked that very conception, that you even needed a revolutionary leadership at all. Look at China, where the Maoist forces had taken control. Look at Cuba, where guerrilla warfare had taken control. Of course, now we can look at these countries and see the results, but it wasn't so clear then. And so the struggle that was taken up by the Trotskyists in this period, in this post-war period, really is of decisive significance. And for those who have not got a copy of The Heritage We Defend, this is, you could say, the textbook of all of these experiences, including the question of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, etc., which is necessary reading. I'd also add as well, there's a glossary at the back, which is extremely helpful, particularly for those who are new to these figures, these names, these parties, which succinctly gives an explanation of all of them. So I highly recommend purchasing that book, making a study of it.
Thanks, Zac and Nick. We are getting numbers of questions coming in, which is great. Thank you for that. I might just move to the next ones so we don't run out of time. There's a couple of questions which I think are related, both of them good ones. We have a question from Gina, who asks, what are the pressures that propelled these individuals like Pablo to split from their thinking? is it simply an act of opportunism? And possibly related, I think related, is from Rod. The question is, in this period, how important was the struggle for the Marxist historical materialism in exposing the Pabloite objectivist method? I think just while our panelists are considering that, I was quickly looking at the question of objectivism. Again, within the heritage we defend on, within the chapter 15, the nature of Pabloite opportunism, this question of what does objectivism mean? Comrade Dave North writes, the standpoint of objectivism is contemplation rather than revolutionary practical activity, of observation rather than struggle. It justifies what is happening rather than explains what must be done. This method provided the theoretical underpinnings for a perspective in which Trotskyism was no longer seen as the doctrine guiding the practical activity of a party determined to conquer power and change the course of history, but rather as the general interpretation of a historical process in which socialism would ultimately be realised under the leadership of non-proletarian forces hostile to the Fourth International. That's the end of the quote. So within that question of objectivism, that is a sort of passive, contemplative standpoint within the context of Pabloism. This was, of course, a crucial method of Pablo to say that the objective world consists of American imperialism and the Stalinist world. In other words, Pabloism rejected any independent role for the international working class, and specifically for the Fourth International. So certainly an opposition to this objectivist approach was a key methodological issue bound up with the struggle against Pabloism. But on the related issues, I might throw it to our panelists.
On Gina's question, which is a very important issue because it raises the origins of opportunism and what is this based on? Are we just talking about the failings, the individual moral failings of a person who just sort of couldn't cut it? Well, no. What we are discussing are the social forces that are at work within the revolutionary movement under a period of immense historical developments, as we tried to go through in the lecture. The basis of opportunism, though, is to be found in that sense, not with the individual character of Pablo, who was, by background, I mean, he was born in Egypt, he joined in Greece, the Fourth International, he moved to Paris, France. He played an important role in the Trotskyist movement. And with all of these figures, I mean, above all, Cannon and Healey, but also, as we said, Shatman, and other layers as well. I mean, Morrow wrote very important work on counter-revolution in Spain. So what are we dealing with here? I mean, in the period of the post-war boom, you had the development of workers' states that had not been witnessed before. And what it appeared to certainly a certain layer, and we have to try and sort of put ourselves in this situation. World War II had just taken place. The immense authority of the Red Army was international. I mean, there are still, if you speak, I'm from a sort of Greek background, you speak to any Greek person who is, a few generations older, 60s, 70s and older, they will speak about, or they have in their conception, the Stalinists defeated the Nazis. For all the crimes that were carried out, that conception was very powerful. And then you had the establishment of workers' states, but not created through a revolutionary movement of the working class like in Russia in 1917, but in a sort of distorted way, in a deformed way, as in the final analysis, a sort of result of the 1917 revolution, because the Stalinist bureaucracy in that sense were extending the property relations that had been established previously, but were doing it under a deeply, doing it from above, bureaucratically. So these were these states could not last in their current form. But, you know, this could appear to an impressionist observer, as we said, as a new wave of the future. And that has to be understood in those conditions. I mean, again, the Second World War, as Cannon says in the open letter, we were, you know, pleasantly sort of surprised and pleased to see sections of the Fourth International re-emerge after the war, which had been in virtual isolation as a result of the war, and the role of fascism throughout Europe. And so it could have appeared, you know, finally we have a sort of, here's something that we can point to, a development. And, you know, it doesn't require a great deal. One just needs to push the Stalinists and they will complete, you know, the revolutionary tasks for the working class to socialism. And that's how it, you know, sort of emerged. And the real implications of it were not clear at the start, but the essentially what it was reflecting were the moods among these middle class, you know, again, impressionist layers, who themselves had adapted to the post-war period. And that found reflection within Pablo. There's a part of the history of the Russian Revolution written by Trotsky where he explains the social origins of the character of Tsar Nicholas, you know, the last Tsar of Russia. And he says to examine the social origins of an individual doesn't detract from whatever crimes that individual committed. They are still responsible. Pablo is still responsible for everything that he did. To understand the origins of them socially means that we're able to combat those same pressures and understand what the real implications of these tendencies are. You know, it doesn't detract from it. As Trotsky said, when you examine the soil of a rose bush, it doesn't change the smell of the flower. And so in the same way, when we examine the social, you know, ground that Pablo grew out of, it doesn't change, you know, the monstrosity of his betrayals. I make those points. We can maybe deal with the second question after.
But just to add to what Zac has raised, we're dealing with an issue that has arisen a number of times. We have insisted that we're not dealing with good or bad individuals, but with social processes. But the question remains, those social processes are reflected and are expressed and are articulated within the movement itself. So how, you could say, how, so to speak, are they sort of smuggled in? How do they get in? And here we come to the complex relationship between social forces and political method. There's a very important point made by David North in the biography of Jerry Healey, where he insists that the cornerstone of the dialectical method of Marxism is a critical attitude to social and political reality. We all live in the world where the facts develop. We don't have a different set of facts which we analyse and so on from anybody else. But the question is a critical attitude towards those facts, to examine their origin. How did they emerge? How did they develop? And the development of opportunism is always bound up with the uncritical acceptance of what appears to be the given reality and the basing of political formulations on that. So it was in the period of the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Cold War existed. There was the expropriation of the bourgeoisie in Eastern Europe. But the crucial question was to examine what was the origin of these developments, what had given rise to these facts. I recall in more recent times, we passed through this experience with regard to Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. Now, I was speaking with Zac about this the other day, and I realised that he was born after the Gorby mania phenomena of 1985. But when Gorbachev came to power, I mean, he was lauded in the press. He was hailed by various political tendencies. This was the new wave. There were massive crowds. There was this phenomenon known as Gorbimania. Far from carrying out reform, Gorbachev was actually leading the way to capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union. And that was very rapidly exposed and revealed.
We do have other questions which I want to get to before we conclude tonight. But before I ask the next questions, which are in relationship to deformed and degenerated worker states, I would like to make an appeal to the Socialist Equality Party's monthly fund. Those of you who've joined us for the previous lectures in this series will know that we rely on the support of ordinary working people, of young people, of intellectuals, best layers of the middle class around the party to support our work. Every month we need to raise within the working class the resources that are necessary to sustain our work. And the work that we carry out does require resources. Those of you who are regular readers of the World Socialist website will see that we have a very substantial increase in the number of articles that are now being posted every day. We also have a very substantial increase in the readership of the website from all around the world. We need to develop that work further, bring more writers onto staff, develop more international coverage, more first-hand journalism. We need to develop audio-visual reporting. All of this work does require resources. And so I'm aware that many of you already contribute very generously to the party, but we're asking you to donate additional amounts. You see the donation information on your slide there. If you're an international participant, you will need to donate to the World Socialist website via that link. It's only if you're an Australian citizen or resident that you can donate to the party here using that link that's on your slide. Those links are also in the chat box there. If you are making a donation or if you can make a pledge tonight, I'd very much encourage you to let us know how much you're donating. And that way we can keep track of the support that you're very generously providing us. It is very much appreciated. This work does need to be taken forward based on the analysis that's been presented in the lecture, in the discussion tonight. We are seeking to build this party internationally, build this party in Australia as the new revolutionary party of the working class. And so the financial support that we receive from you plays an important role in that work. While you're considering your donations and pledges and letting us know how much that's for, I will read the next set of questions, which come from I believe it's two different participants. One participant says, was it correct to call the deformed worker states actually worker states at all, since they were not created through the independent revolutionary action of the working class? Wouldn't calling them worker states at all undermine the correct position that only the working class could establish a worker state and no bureaucracy or petty bourgeois organisation could do it for them? Trotsky outlined the perspective of degenerated worker state, but deformed worker state was never part of that. It seems to me to be a concept that was injected from the outset by the Pabloists, but what do you think? I believe it's the same participant then asks in a follow-up question, could you explain deformed worker state and degenerated worker state with examples? And then another participant asks, what is the difference policy-wise and mechanistically between a bureaucratically made top-down worker state and a worker state made and run by the working class? All important questions, and all of which are covered in The Heritage We Defend. So again, encourage everybody posing those questions to purchase that book. But I'll throw it to Zac and Nick. Which one of you would like to go first on that one?
I'll just make a brief point. The issue of every sociological characterization is a political prognosis or a political perspective. And our characterization of the Eastern European states defined our attitude of the Trotskyist movement to the nationalized property relations that have been established. Yes, bureaucratically and by expropriation, but Trotsky had raised this question in defense of Marxism, and in relationship to the Soviet Union's invasion of Poland under the Stalin-Hitler Pact. And he explained there that the working class had a responsibility to defend the nationalization of property relations that had taken place, and the Trotskyist movement in the post-war period adopted the same attitude in relation to the formation of these buffer states. But we placed the great emphasis, as we insisted, the fundamental character of these states was their deformity. But it did define the attitude of the Trotskyist movement towards the defense of the nationalized property relations against imperialism and against the return of the bourgeoisie in these states.
I mean, I'd just add to that, I think a previous question asked about the relationship between historical materialism and Pabloid objectivism, and I think that points to an important methodological question, which, and I know we sound like we're on a stuck record here, but really the Heritage We Defend contains an entire chapter which deals with the methodological way in which this whole question of deformed worker states was, transformed into, as Nick said, the emphasis shifted from deformed onto worker state. Now, the issue is not a sort of list of policies or the way Hansen put it in relation to Cuba. You have nationalization of production plus a few other things, therefore it's a worker state. This extremely sort of pragmatic approach. The question of the character of a state can only be understood on the basis of the class that established it and that it represents and its historical origins. Questioners are asking about, the difference between deformed and degenerated worker state. The term degenerated was used by Trotsky to explain the processes that were underway in the Soviet Union with the usurpation of power by the Stalinist bureaucracy. This was a worker state established by the working class in the 1917 October Revolution, which seized power, and so far is the only example of a successful socialist revolution in history. Created a worker state, which was then, as we've gone through in previous lectures, betrayed by Stalinism. Now, what then developed in the post-war period as we went through was a state of a highly complex and contradictory character. But in the final analysis, the property relations that were established in these, as they were called, buffer states, East Germany, Yugoslavia, has its own history, but all across this region was the workers' state. Its economic base was the expropriation of capitalist property, but this was carried out in that sense, from above. And so its health could not be guaranteed. Now, the question of deformed was worked out and advanced not by the Pabloites, who were, Pablo first put forward his positions in 1951, let's remember. That's when he was first articulating these conceptions, that the worker states would provide a way for the future. The question of deformed worker states was worked out within the Trotskyist movement much earlier, in the aftermath of their formation. And what they had to rest on was the same process, the same method that Trotsky used to establish that the Soviet Union was still a worker state, but had degenerated. In that sense, to examine what its class, its property relations really were. But one has to also ask, what are the implications of saying that these were not workers' states? There was nothing then in that sense to defend, there was nothing that could be defended or should be defended, as Nick, went through. The principle of the defense of the USSR was one that was rejected by Burnham and Shatman, and then afterwards by Morrow and Goldman. In the Socialist Workers' Party, these tendencies And always this was associated with a rejection of the working class, because what was being rejected in that sense wasn't, Stalinism. In that sense, the crimes of Stalinism were being used as the justification for the repudiation, and the rejection of the revolutionary role of the working class. Look what it produces: Stalinist barbarism, etc. So we have to be, in that sense, we have to take our line from Trotsky and the way in which he, we're talking about someone who was the focus of the bureaucracy's counter-revolutionary machine. The analysis that he made, which was to base himself on the property relations Marxist method.
Thank you, Zac. In the Heritage We Defend, just briefly to add to the answers which have been given on this, in the chapter in the Heritage We Defend titled "The Metaphysics of Nationalised Property," David North raises that the decision to categorise the states that emerged in Eastern Europe as deformed worker states was not a wrong definition, as he raises it. With all dialectical concepts, that of a deformed worker state is acceptable and retains its validity only within a given historical and political tolerance. Now, the emphasis, as Zac raised, was always on the word deformed. And in the Heritage We Defend, we make the following point, quote, "The use of the term deformed places central attention upon the crucial historical difference between the overthrow of the capitalist state in October 1917 and the overturns which occurred in the late 1940s in Eastern Europe. That is, the absence of the mass organs of proletarian power, Soviets, led by a Bolshevik type party. Moreover, the term itself implies the merely transitory existence of state regimes of dubious historical viability, whose actions in every sphere, political and economic, bear the stamp of the distorted and abnormal character of their birth," end quote. Now, that was written before the liquidation of the Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe, but that's certainly that process bore out what Dave was writing there about the transitory character of these states. But by defining them as deformed worker states, it outlined the political task of the Fourth International, which was to, in the final analysis, defend them against imperialist assault, defend the nationalised property relations, defend the monopoly on foreign trade that existed, while fighting for a political revolution of the working class against these regimes. We have time for just one more question, I believe, before we conclude this evening. We are up to, just to let meeting participants know, we're up to $590 pledged to the monthly fund. That's been indicated in the chat box, so we very much appreciate that. Thank you very much to everybody who's pledged or donated money. If you haven't already, please consider doing so, even if it's a small amount. Every little bit helps. We very much appreciate the sacrifices that workers and young people are making in support of our party in this challenging economic time. The final question is that I would like to raise, and there are other questions, apologies if we haven't got to your question, but there is an important one connecting these issues to the political tasks confronting the Trotskyist movement today. The question is, Zac, you talked about the essence of the Pabloites, the essence being the liquidation of the Trotskyists into existing movements, subjugated to the perspectives of the Stalinists, social democratic parties, and petty bourgeois nationalists, like in Cuba. How is this reflected in the pseudo-left today?
I mean, the evolution of these tendencies is a monumental stampede to the right. I mean, when we're talking about, Burnham, Chapman, these figures, we are talking about the reflection of petty bourgeois, middle class sort of layers of the intelligentsia finding reflection in the Trotskyist movement. These movements have now broken completely with all remnants of Trotskyism, of Marxism. They have no connection whatsoever to the working class. They have now been allowed, in that sense, to complete their sort of transformations. They have been on this reactionary trajectory now for decades, and you can see this in their politics. How does this find expression? I mean, what we discussed what we were sort of raising at the end of the lecture was the question of these protests over over the death of George Floyd, and what is being reflected in them. Our analysis on the World Socialist website is that this cannot be understood as a question of simply anger over racism or anger over police violence, which is without question present and palpable, but more fundamental, subterranean, questions of a class character are beginning to emerge. And you can see this, but only in initial form in these protests, which have been predominantly based on, young people have been involved in these. Now, the ruling elite, and they are very conscious of this, is aware of the fact that the working class is once again entering into the arena. And they have written about it very, very consciously and clearly. I forget the name of the organization now, Patrick and Nick no doubt will indicate it, but a leading think tank of the bourgeoisie and of imperialism said that the main issues that will confront the capitalist class today is revolutionary movements which are at present leaderless. These are leaderless revolutions taking place around the world and of the working class, but which have a insurrectionary, a revolutionary character contained within them. Now, what is the role of these, as we've termed them, the pseudo-left? And when we say pseudo-left, we mean all of these tendencies. Socialist Alliance, Socialist Alternative, Solidarity, you can list them off. But their essential class function now is as representatives of an upper middle class layer, what we've sort of defined as the next 9% under the top 1%, whose principal concern and orientation is the acquisition of more wealth for themselves. Their concern is the division of wealth down, but it stops at the top 10%. And you can see within their obsession over race, and this is expressed very, very clearly in the 1619 Project, in the Me Too movement, in tendency after tendency, in which they seek to elevate the questions of identity beyond any other consideration. And in doing so, there's a sort of twofold function to this. On the one hand, it is, as we said, the distribution of wealth within the top 10%. But on the other hand, there is a fundamental attempt to block the inherent, instinctive class solidarity that exists within the international working class. And last year, we noted on the World Socialist website, was increasingly being articulated in protests and strike movements around the world. And their response is one of a class character. But again, this isn't the question of it being reflected sort of within the Trotskyist movement and tendencies within the, within the Fourth International. No, we're talking about tendencies that have broken. And so what they are expressing in that sense is the direct needs of imperialism as it exists now. So in the 1950s, imperialism required a buffer. It sought it and it found it, it established it through, Pabloism. That's ultimately what Pabloism represented, was the buffer between the working class and imperialism. Well, now, perhaps even more so than in the 1950s, imperialism needs a buffer. And that's the role played by these tendencies. But they do it on the basis of, as I said, without any connection to the working class. I mean, they barely even talk about socialism, let alone Trotskyism anymore. And so what the Socialist Equality Party and what young people in particular and workers have to do is to assimilate the lessons of these historical experiences. Because when you are seeking to make an analysis, an assessment of the politics of Socialist Alternative or Socialist Alliance, you cannot do it from what they tell you immediately. You can only do it on the basis of where their origins, their political origins come from. And so what we have to do now, really is take forward this perspective, that perspective that was defended and articulated by Cannon and then by Healey And next week, we're going to deal with the conclusion of the Civil War in the split with the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which Comrade Oscar will deal with and explain, how in the end these forces were defeated. Because in the final analysis, what the Trotskyists, which at various times, I mean, you could count them on one hand. I mean, it hung by a thread, but it was continued. The continuity of Trotskyism was maintained. But now we are in a period in which the Trotskyist Party, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the Socialist Equality Parties must increasingly assume the leadership role and to guide the working class in revolutionary struggles that will be of a monumental and profoundly international character. And the chief obstacle that the working class confronts in that struggle is not, in that sense, Stalinism and social democracy anymore. It is the pseudo-left. It is the heirs, the political heirs of the Burnhams and the Pabloites. And in order to chart its independent revolutionary course, it has to make a class assessment and understanding of these layers.
Thank you, Zac. That's a comprehensive answer. Nick, did you want to add anything briefly to that?
Well, I just underscore that point. I mean, what does the bourgeoisie fear above all else? It's the intervention of the working class into these enormous historic developments. We issued a perspective today on the World Socialist website. I urge comrades to read it, explaining that this is the decisive question in the fight against the coronavirus. The independent intervention of the working class to take control of society and begin to organise it. And that means a fight, political struggle. It's significant. Why does the leading organ of the American bourgeoisie, the New York Times, launch last year the 1619 Project to maintain that the central problem in America is not class but race? These things don't happen accidentally, precisely to divert the movement that is now developing. Because if you had, a movement of the American working class, if it intervenes, and that's what we're fighting for, it is the most powerful force in the world. And the old slogan, divide and conquer, split the working class up into various identities, black, white, sexual orientation, and so on. That's the essential class role of these forces, and it's bound up with their material interests. As Zac has explained, this is not just a question of wrong ideology. A movement of the working class would completely disrupt the financialization, the markets upon which all of these layers depend. So there is ideology and class interest come together.
Thank you, Nick and Zac. Those answers provide a good segue to conclude the meeting by really making an appeal to all those involved to join this movement. We're obviously reviewing this history not for academic purposes, but in order to clarify the political basis upon which the international working class can intervene into the situation and resolve this crisis. There is a real urgency to the situation. The dangers that we now confront in relationship to the threat of a renewed world war, the threat of fascistic and extreme right-wing forces being fueled from within the White House now, the threat of climate change and environmental destruction. These are real and pressing matters that the working class needs to resolve by abolishing the root cause of all of these problems, and that is the profit system itself. That requires ordinary people, workers, young people, to come off the sidelines, to get involved and to build this party. That's what's objectively posed by the situation. We are a party unlike any other. We have a spotless banner. We can review our history as we're doing through this series, unlike other political tendencies which seek to suppress any examination of their own rotten, miserable histories, manoeuvring between this or that opportunist formation. The International Committee of the Fourth International's very existence is bound up with the struggle against all forms of opportunism. and that's the basis upon which the working class can establish its political independence, break with all forces, parties, organisations tied to the bourgeoisie, and establish a new revolutionary movement. You see on our slide there the statement of principles. That's a very succinct summation of the key principles of our party. That's the basis upon which you join. So I encourage you to email Mehring Books. That's Mehring, M-E-H-R-A-N-G, at aussiemail.com.au. You can order your copy of the Statement of Principles. You can contact us via that link there as well. You see the link to Mehring Books and the email in the chat box. We'd encourage you to give serious consideration to making the most important decision of your life and joining our World Party. We do need to conclude the meeting tonight. Apologies again for those of you who put a question and we didn't have time to get to it. I believe earlier in the chat box there was you were encouraged to contact the SCP with that question. We can have further discussion in different formats to answer any questions or any other points that you'd like to raise. Please keep in mind the appeal to purchase The Heritage We Defend and the biography of Jerry Healey. Again, follow the email address there that you can send to Mehring Books for those specially discounted offers on those two key works. Next week, same time, same place, we will be continuing this lecture series. Next week's lecture is on, as Zac raised earlier, the 1985-86 split with the Workers' Revolutionary Party and the renaissance of Marxism. This is really a critical period of the history of the Fourth International, the moment at which the International Committee decisively defeated the forces of opportunism that were emerging within Britain, and really laid the basis for a really flowering of Marxist theory and practice, of which the World Socialist website forms one part. So that's next Tuesday, June 30. Please make sure you have emailed us your details. Make sure you leave us your contact information if you haven't already, so that we can be sure to let you know close to the event. The Zoom link is available through the World Socialist website, through Socialist Equality Party, social media, and other publications. But we'll conclude there. Thank you very much for everybody's participation. Thank you very much for your generous financial contributions. That's really important. And thank you, comrades Zac and Nick, for tonight's responses. Thanks very much.